Welcome back to AM Prime, and we are continuing our discussion about COVID-19, but we're taking a very different angle. But something that I have been raising time and time again, and is the government communicating well its desire for the citizenry to act in a particular way. We are accustomed to the weekly buff by Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley, and some persons see it as something funny and memeable in other cases. And I know for a fact that many persons tune in to the live conferences and they make bacchanal, so to say, in the comment section, and then everyone gets serious from the time the Prime Minister says, as of midnight tonight. But all of these things are part of how the government intends to communicate and has been communicating over the past year. So I have with me now the lead consultant at Demming Communications. And for some reason, I always have an urge to say Dr. Dennise Demming. I don't know, I'm probably forecasting something. But I have with me Dennise Demming, who is the lead consultant at Demming Communications. And we're going to take a deep dive into this discussion. Dennise, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me. No, it is not Dr. Dennise Demming. There is a Dr. Keita Demming. And you won't be calling me doctor for a while. I won't be doing that. Anyway, communication has always been my passion, and thank you for having me.
No problem at all. So the first question I want to ask you, because not many people understand this, there is a difference between government communications or public communications and then things such as corporate communications, public relations, and so forth. Could you make the distinction for us?
The major distinction is that in a corporation, you're operating for profit, and that becomes your primary motivator. When you're talking about government sector, the NGO sector, the social sector, you are generally communicating in the interest of people. So you're looking to do good. You're looking to change behavior. So that is the basic difference. The drivers are still very deep in terms of the outcome. So when we look at government communication, we always have to ask the question, what is the intention? What is the intended outcome? And I love Simon Sinek, who talks about, if you don't know your why, then it doesn't matter.
And speaking about the Minister of Communications, we do have a Ministry of Communications that falls under the Office of the Prime Minister, and many persons would think, well, that's the only avenue that you can expect communications from the state. But there are in fact other avenues by which communication is passed through. Would you mind highlighting some of those?
You communicate all the time, so that even if there is a ministry, every time the Prime Minister opens his mouth, he communicates. Every time a minister opens their mouth, they communicate. When they walk on the street, they communicate. So they are always communicating. The messages may not be intended, but you communicate on an ongoing basis. You can't turn off communication. While there's a formality of the ministry and there's a role for the ministry, what has happened in this COVID situation is that the Prime Minister has become the chief communicator to the population. Yes?
And as you say, not being able to turn off communications and formal and informal communications. We've seen in recent time where members of Parliament have gotten in trouble for writing things on their Facebook page, and this being brought to the attention of either the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate. So that gives credence to the fact that you can't turn off communication, and because you're seen as being an official and someone representing particular voices and representing be it a body, the government or the opposition, it is so very important to mind what you are saying. But messages. What are the messages that you get out of these press conferences, the communication from the government? Because the average person may get a particular message, but someone such as yourself, a lead consultant at Demming Communication, a communication professional for all of these years, how do you judge or assess the communication strategy being employed by the government?
That's a big question, but my assessment, and let me just take a perspective that goes back a year ago, 14 months ago. 14 months ago, when we said have this method of communicating in which the Prime Minister took the lead. It was well done. We didn't know where we were going. We didn't know what was happening. We were all confused. We were all trying to find a new path. So that kind of taking a strong lead and giving us instructions, it worked. And it worked because we were in a crisis. But when you have an extended crisis over 14 months, the strategy has to change. Because at the moment, certainly from my perspective, I am communicated out with regard to those press conferences. They're too long. They give you figures that if you're not quantitative, it's hard for you to follow. And I know people say, if you can't follow that, you're stupid. Well, I joined that batch because I generally have to figure out, okay, so how does this compare internationally? Yeah. How does this compare with last week? I'll give you an example. There's a doctor I heard on radio yesterday morning. I think is Ram Lacan. Let me not quote the name. Sure. Let me quote the message. She said, our spike is now greater than India. When she said that, it hit home to me because it was a graphic. I could see it. I have a point of comparison. What we have and what we're seeing on a daily basis, whatever, is people coming to us. The technocrats are telling us some stuff. A lot of us look at the technocrats and we say, yes, I am happy with that, what that person is saying to me. But then the ministers come and you generally have a tone, for instance, by the Minister of Health, that I've told you this before, I don't understand why you're not hearing it. Mm-hmm. Then you generally have a big buff by the Prime Minister. And sometimes his language is absolutely inappropriate. Now, you cannot do that for 14 months and think your messages will land. You have to do something different. Mm-hmm.
And yes. You're correct, because we have a situation where the government has had to embark on a state of emergency. Prior to that, stricter lockdown measures. And prior to that, well, we have the health ordinances. And it seems as though the government believes all that it is doing is right. And it's, why aren't you doing it? The way I compare it is a parent who tells your child, don't do this, but does not take the proper time to explain. And an explanation does not simply mean putting up a big graphic and all of this, but understanding how that child understands and interprets and learns and meeting them on the half. Would you say that that would be a fair assessment of how things should be going?
That's a fair assessment. And what I think is lacking is a nuanced approach to communication. We're taking this public communication method, but I am not seeing anything on the ground. I'll give you, if I could go to what I see as solutions. When an election is called, there are, even if you didn't hear the announcement, two things happen that make you know an election is called. All of a sudden, ministers are in their communities walking. So from the time you see a minister walking around, you know it's election time. The second thing that you have, and which is quite, it's unique to us, are the speaker cars giving you the messages. And those speaker cars, in my area, the last election, I had about 4 speaker cars per day in my area telling me to vote and how to vote and so on. Why haven't we deployed strategies like that in this time of crisis? Instead, all of the ministers are still in the air conditioning offices peeping out at people who are struggling and in crisis. Some of them are giving out some pretty looking hampers, but we need more than that. One of the first things that ministers ought to be doing at their own risk is getting into the communities and walking. The same way you walk and you ask people for your vote, you need to be walking and asking people to do what is right, to sanitize. You need to demonstrate that you're wearing your mask properly and you're walking through the hot sun, you're walking through the rain, you're walking night and day. You need to be pounding your communities now because that's where they want the message. When you want their vote, you go there and you send the messages. The other thing we should be doing is this country, every speaker car owner or anybody who could communicate a message on a speaker car should be out there blasting the communities about the key messages. Instead, what we've done is we've stood on a pulpit and cuss the people. That won't work. People do not behave. The behavior change does not occur through instruction. It occurs through an understanding of a shared outcome. It occurs through fear, and we realize that fear motivation is not working. And it occurs if people feel they are part of the strategy. And none of these things are happening.
Yeah, and on that last point, and this is my final question, unfortunately, people don't feel a part of the government's strategy. They don't feel as though they are contributing, and quite often the government and or the Prime Minister and representatives, be it ministers, say, I have been advised by, or the experts have told me. But really, where are the experts in communication? Where are the average Joe who has something to say? Because many persons are sitting at home, coming up with ideas, coming up with strategies, some very good ones, but it is not getting to the desk of the Prime Minister or to the technocrats who matter. Why do you think there continues to be this disconnect between the state or the government and the people? Because it almost feels as though the government has to be insulated away from public opinions and public strategies. Why do you think the disconnect exists?
You've answered the question. Governments and ministers and MPs are disconnected once they get into power. If they've been traveling, if any of them had been traveling using maxis and so on, they stop that. They now have a chauffeur, but they disconnect from their communities. If they meet with people on their days, whatever day they meet in their constituencies, that is a checkbox item, but they are disconnected. And if you're disconnected from a people, you cannot lead them. You do not understand them. One of the issues we ought to be looking at is, given that the Brazilian strain is in this country, should we be communicating in Spanish? That to me is an issue that has to be addressed. Otherwise, we are going to continue until the world has taken charge and we have herd immunity and world vaccination. We are going to continue in lockdown upon lockdown upon lockdown. And unfortunately, what we are communicating to people is that you're going to die one way or the other. If you don't die from COVID, you're going to die from mental health issues, or you're going to die from non-communicable diseases, which means stress and hypertension and all of that. Something has to change this game. And the changing of the game requires leadership that is empathetic, that is humble, and that is people-centered. And I am not seeing that.
A grim reality, but a reality that we do have to face. Let me thank you so very much for joining me this morning. And I will take the lead in terms of switching up the communication and say muchas gracias. So hopefully, hopefully it sticks. Thank you so very much, Dennise Demming, lead consultant at Demming Communications, and a communication professional who takes the time to analyze, to put out the information. And I know that she is a writer for Wired 868 and has been putting out some very intriguing pieces. So thank you so very much. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, more here on AM Prime.